the first thing I'd like to do is introduce our moderator. Lisa Marginelli is a fellow at the New American Foundation. She has written extensively about oil, alternative energy, and she is known especially for her book that she recently authored called Oil on the Brain. This work manifested itself after doing 4 years of research on the oil industry. And if you guys are interested in knowing it a little bit better, we have it right here. But with that being said, we're going to address some really, really critical questions I'm sure many of you have in here. It's going to be very engaging. This is going to be a debate that my hope is gets you going away talking about what was here, asking more questions, more so than anything else. So without further ado, your moderator for this panel, Lisa Marginelli.
Hello, and thank you for coming. I think it's a real testament to Berk's growing network and their growing influence and kind of penetration throughout the community that they could draw not only such a huge crowd of people to this room, but also such a crowd of distinguished panelists here. I actually, we have people here, we have someone from Shell, someone from Chevron, and someone from BP working, all of them working on alternative fuels in one form or another. This morning I got up. Do I sound very echoey? Am I too close to the microphone for you? All right. This morning I was trying to research just what the revenues of these three companies were recently, and I came up with that these three oil companies together had revenues of over $800 million. And then, of course, when we add Professor Borenstein to the panel, we're well over $1 trillion. That was a joke for those listening on the internet. I'll introduce them first, and then I'll talk a little bit about this panel, which has been named Can Fossils Evolve? And perhaps it's a sort of a sharp topic for the panel, but or a title, but I'll get into some of the specifics in a minute. First, I have Dr. Paul Willems, who is the Technology Vice President for Energy Biosciences at BP. He's responsible for integrating biotechnology into BP's business activity. He's also Associate Director for the Energy Biosciences Institute here. Trained as a chemical engineer, he's worked in petrochemicals for 20 years. Next to him is Dr. Eve Sprunt from Chevron. She is the University Partnership and Recruitment Manager for Chevron. She was trained as a geophysicist, and she was the Senior Technical Advisor for Venture Equities and Energy and Power Funds for Chevron Technology Ventures. Before joining Chevron in 2000, she spent 21 years with Mobil. Also in 2006, she was president of the Society of Petroleum Engineers. And so we have a very interesting panel in part because of their different backgrounds. One person from chemical engineering, another person from geophysics. And over here, we have Gabriel de Schiemaker, who is the CEO of Solana. Solana is a new company. I think it's 3 months old. It's making vegetable oil from algae. It's based in Hawaii. It's a joint venture between Shell and HR Biopetroleum. In 1999, Gabriel helped Shell create Shell Hydrogen, and then between 2004 and 2007, he managed and developed Shell's hydrogen activities in the Asia Pacific. He was trained in electrotechnical engineering, and he's been with Shell for 17 years. And then here we have Professor Severin Borenstein. He barely needs an introduction here, but he's Professor of Business Administration and Public Policy in the Economic Analysis and Policy Group of the Haas School of Business, and he's also Director of the UC Energy Institute. And I think he's really been kind of a leader in the area on looking behind the myths of how we use and buy energy and trying to find the actual numbers. He's done a lot of work on electrical power use and also on gasoline. These are really interesting times for alternative fuel. On Wednesday, as you know, oil hit its highest adjusted price ever. And on that same day, President Bush made a speech in which he said that we have to get off oil. And that's very interesting as a rhetorical change from, say, 7 years ago when this administration really wasn't talking about getting off oil at all or wasn't talking about alternative fuels. Now, what I also find significant is that right after that, he mentioned that he'd arrived, jokingly, he mentioned that he had arrived in a motorcade of 20 cars. And I think there's a real tension right now between the talk about alternative fuels and the fact that we are all really driving in this gigantic inertia-filled motorcade of 200 million vehicles. How this shakes out, how the desire to change into alternative fuels versus just the incredible strength of this infrastructure of pipelines, oil wells, refineries is really going to be very, very interesting over the next couple of years. And that kind of brings us to the oil industry. Between the three companies that are willing to talk up here, they have about 30 billion barrels of oil reserves. So each of these companies that also has a very aggressive alternative fuel program also has huge reserves in the ground. They also have miles and miles and miles of pipelines. I was trying to find the numbers for you, but I couldn't. One company has 25,000 trucks. The numbers start to sort of multiply out. Another one has 47 refineries around the world. Another one works in 25 countries around the world. You have a real, an enormous sort of octopus of pipelines, tankers, weight of this previous oil and the infrastructure, and yet all are starting to make investments in alternative fuels, although cautious investments. And this brings me to this sort of another thing that I think is really interesting about oil companies is that we think about them as providers of oil, but in many ways, one of the things that they do really well is they think about risk. Oil companies have to take risks with capital, they take political risks, they take chemical risks in terms of the product that they transport exploding, they take environmental risks. An extraordinary number of risks need to be analyzed really carefully and then figured out how to play them. And in many ways, I think of oil companies as incredible poker players. And in the case of alternative fuels, we're really looking at, I think, a 50-year poker game. And this is a chance here this afternoon to kind of talk to people as they're starting to sit down at the game and talk about how they're going to play their cards, because each of the companies that are on the panel has a different kind of strategy. So what we're going to do is start with each of them talking for maybe a few minutes, just maybe 3 or 4 minutes each, about their company's overall strategy and the types of fuels that they're working on. And then we'll get into some other questions. And for the last 10 minutes or so, if we have time, we'll take questions from the audience. Okay, I'd like to start. Would you like to start, Paul? Shall I turn myself off?
I think we're taking some action over there. Yeah, okay. First of all, I would like to say that, and I think I speak on behalf of all of us, that we don't consider ourselves as fossils, necessarily. We're very much part of society today, and we are trying to live and evolve in society today. So if you look at BP's journey in, and I like to use the words alternative energy rather than alternative fuel, because I think it broadens the spectrum a little bit from just fuels to energy provision. So BP's journey in alternative energy is actually quite a long one, and BP was one of the first major oil companies to actually publicly take a position that climate change was a serious issue and that we really should be erring on the side of caution when it comes to climate change. And BP's CEO stood up and did that all the way back in 1997. At a speech at Stanford. And so that kind of started or expanded our journey into the field of alternative energy, if you will, because from our company's perspective, we see the future of energy being shaped quite heavily by two issues. One is climate change, like I just talked about, and the second one is security of supply issues. Within our own company, we don't describe ourselves as an oil company or an oil and gas company. We look at ourselves as an energy company. In the long-term context, the provision of energy is what our company is all about. And so while alternative energy is arguably a small part of the companies that sit here today in today's world, I think all of us probably see it as potentially an important leg that our companies are going to be built on in the 20 and 30 and 40-year horizon. And indeed, we have to think in that sort of length of time scales when it comes to our business in general. So based on our views on climate change as a real issue, we basically within the company kicked off a bunch of activities to say, well, so if you look at energy in that context, what can you do about it, and what is prudent to go after? And so the initiatives in BP ranged all the way from demand-side management, which was simple things of how can we make our own manufacturing facilities more efficient, how can we save on the energy that we use internally, all the way to what kind of research programs or technology programs could we pursue to help buildings become more efficient and cars become more efficient, etc. So that's one end of the spectrum on the demand side, but that on the supply side, we quickly realized that not all energy is made equal. And things that you can do in industrial settings or things that you can do for power plants are different than the kinds of things you can do for automobiles or the energy consumption in our house. So we quickly went down a path of pursuing various options for various segments of the market, if you will. So as we sit here today, BP is one of the largest solar panel producers, and we continue to grow that business and expand that business, not driven by a high profit motive at this point in time, I'm afraid I have to say. But nevertheless, it's a growing business. We've got a very sizable wind turbine, both installed capacity and rapidly growing capacity. So we've got about 1 gigawatt installed by the end of this year, and we've got a development pipeline for another 12 to 15 gigawatts following on that. So quite a large supply base. We also have activities in terms of promoting gas-fired power rather than coal-fired. So not quite entirely carbon-free, but a lot more carbon-free than coal-fired. And we are the size of a mid-sized utility company, if you sort of total up all of our businesses in that area. And then the gas-fired power kind of naturally progresses into hydrogen power, coupled with carbon capture and sequestration, which obviously is a key technology for anybody who is serious about climate change and doing things about it. We really have carbon capture and sequestration as one of the key building blocks that we have to get on top of and that we have to develop as sound and commercially viable. And then last but not least, in the transportation sector, we've basically been pursuing biofuels. Current generation biofuels quite carefully, I must say, because we don't necessarily see that as quite as sound as it needs to be. But a lot of investment going into lignocellulosics-based biofuels, as well as molecules that go well beyond ethanol and are much more desirable from a fuel pool perspective than the current generation of biofuels. So.
Okay, and next will be Yves Sprung from Chevron.
Am I on? Okay. I guess looking at this, we heard about how this was a big poker game. And I think it's very appropriate to think about how little we really know about the future and predicting the future. And so when we look at what the potential suppliers of energy are bringing to the table, that's only part of it. I was thinking about that because I'd planned to drive here in my car from Dublin, which was about 32 miles, but I ended up taking BART. And it wasn't because of the price of oil. It was because I thought about Friday afternoon traffic and because I hadn't written my remarks. And so riding BART enabled me to write my remarks. So when we think about all this, there are a tremendous number of unknowns. And part of that is what the customer does. And what the customer does and what the customer says are two very different things. Hypocrisy is probably one of the original sins out there. So that said, in terms of an approach to this, and looking at the fact that in terms of energy, we're living in very interesting times, where great fortunes will be made and lost. Giant companies will come and go. When you look at, kind of equivalents in the much more fast-moving computer world, when Microsoft was no one and IBM was the behemoth, that you heard about how huge the companies are, and we all hope to stay huge, which is why we're placing these bets. But there are no guarantees who the big players of the future will be. We hope we will be. We think we have the competencies to be a major player, but no one really knows. So Chevron is pursuing all forms of energy and hasn't chosen one over another. We've been a player in this for a very long time. For over 30 years, Chevron or its predecessor companies have been involved in geothermal power. We are currently the largest private geothermal power producer in the world. Chevron also operates the largest hydrogen infrastructure in the US, including 3 stations in California, one nearby here in Oakland, where we produce hydrogen on site to fuel a fleet of fuel cell-powered buses and cars. If you look at how we work as a company, because part of this was what's our approach, is Chevron practices open innovation. So in looking at this, we're looking to collaborate with other companies. And an example of that in terms of looking at collaboration is we started a biofuels unit in 2006. And that biofuels unit is involved in a very large number of partnerships already. We partner with national labs, in this case, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We partner with multiple universities. Indeed, my current role is in building university partnerships all around the world. In terms of biofuels, we're partnered with UC Davis, Georgia Tech, Texas A&M, and Texas A&M, to name a few of them. We partner with other companies. We're partnered in terms of biofuels because it involves different competencies with Weyerhaeuser, the giant paper products and lumber company, as a potential source of the biomass. If you look at energy, every form of energy, no matter what it is, has a footprint. So when you look out there, a lot of times it's just we don't know what the environmental impact is now. When I look at the efforts around biofuels to come up with enzymes to digest cellulose, I think about how much we worry about bioengineered fish, the wild salmon escaping and polluting the gene pool, the ranch salmon. When we look at the concerns about biofoods, you could think about the concerns around enzymes that can rapidly digest cellulose. What could happen if you had an enzyme that could actually survive in the wild that was much more enhanced in that? So there are many unknowns. When I was a kid going to school, CO2 was a colorless, odorless gas that made up much of the atmosphere. So if you say, with all kinds of fuels, what's the thing that you can do that has the minimum environmental impact and makes the biggest difference? And it's actually energy efficiency. So if you look at Chevron as a company that believes that the most efficient economical source of new energy is energy efficiency, and it is one of the best ways to reduce greenhouse gas, we practice what we preach. Since 1992, Chevron has reduced the amount of energy it takes per unit output by 27%. So as you look forward, we're working across the entire spectrum, including very aggressively and very successfully pursuing energy efficiency.
Thank you. And Gabriel de Shoemaker from Shell.
Let me tell you a bit about Shell's strategy. We have in alternative energy only. Our objective is that we have one profitable business in 2015. A profitable business for us means that it's visible on our annual report. And that is quite a task, actually. Now, we have 4 focus areas, 2 in energy and 2 in mobility. In energy, it's North America wind, onshore wind. In energy, the other one in energy is solar thin film, CIS. That's where we're putting our money. In mobility, we're looking and investing in hydrogen and in biofuels. And especially biofuels, we're looking at second generation biofuels. We're big in first generation, but we think there are major issues with that, and that is an unsustainable way forward. So we must succeed in second generation biofuels. Well, until 2005, we invested about $1 billion. And that did not lead to much, actually. So again, this is for us a signal that the challenge is enormous. Now this, what I just told you, you can also see, watch or read on our website. Let me give you some granularity beneath this. Some of our strategy is reactive. That reacts to mandates and legislation. So we don't really control it. We just try to do the best we can. And now I'm talking about the first generation biofuels. Some of it is proactive, and I'm talking about CO2 here. I think it's a question that was asked of John Doerr. Yes, we try to influence legislation, of course. Not all the legislation is very smart, and therefore, for instance, we believe that a ton of CO2 captured is just as good as a ton of CO2 saved. And we succeeded in getting that type of legislation implemented. We also assume that externalities will be priced. Well, maybe it's obvious now, it wasn't obvious a few years ago. If that's not the case, if CO2 will not be priced, all this strategy is, of course, nonsense. Why would you? Why would you go into this area? You just concentrate on oil shales and oil sands only. We use venture capital. Our direct investments are through venture capital initiatives. We are pretty bad at that. We are looking at how to improve such direct investments. Maybe later in the discussion I can talk a bit more about that. And we invest through funds. We have set up a few VC funds to look into this area. And maybe the last thing I will mention is that to do this effectively, we reorganized our business in a new unit under our downstream business, and this new unit is the future fuels and CO2 business. And in this unit, you will find our gas to liquids business, the biofuels business, the hydrogen business, wind, solar, and our CO2 business.
Great, thank you. So one of the issues here is, as you know, the title of this is "Can Fossils Evolve?" And I guess there's a second question here is do we, as consumers, as citizens of the world, want the oil companies or feel that they have an obligation to provide us with alternative fuels? And so we're going to address this sort of from 2 ways. I mean, is it a really good thing for an oil company to be building its own competition? That's a kind of a provocative question. Can we expect them to do the best job of doing something other than oil? And I think the other question is do we want them to? And for that, we're just going to kind of kick off this section with Professor Borenstein talking a little bit about some of the thinking that he's been doing about whether or not that's something that we should be expecting from oil companies and what we should actually be expecting. And then we're going to kind of segue into a conversation about where the companies talk about why it is part of their strategy and why it is part of a sort of a core business idea.
Thanks, Lisa. I guess I'm supposed to set up the discussion a bit. Let me make a couple of points. This is obviously a topic that's in the news quite a bit. It is very hard to listen to politicians discuss alternative energy without at the same time discussing the profits of these and other oil companies. And with the implication that because these oil companies are making a lot of money, they have an obligation to invent alternatives to the product line that's making them a lot of money, which in itself doesn't, I think, make a lot of sense. In fact, oil companies are making a lot of money because they happen to own oil. When the price of oil went up, these oil companies will be the first to tell you that they don't set the price of oil, and they are just the lucky beneficiaries of being in the oil business now. And so the fact that they're making a lot of money right now, I think should no more be a reason to expect them to do the investment in alternative energy that does need to be done than they would be, than would be the case if they were making a lot less money and the price of oil were low, but we still had a CO2 problem. That's, I think, a pretty clear argument, particularly when you realize that although some of these alternative energy sources do have some complementarities with what oil companies do for a living. When you think about geothermal, I'm sure that part of the attraction is they know a lot about drilling. When you think about alternative liquid transportation fuels, they know a lot about actually moving liquid fuels around and distributing them. They don't actually know, and they know a lot about chemistry. But if you ask who's going to make the next breakthrough in solar cells, I would argue that it might be oil companies, but there's actually no reason to think they have any comparative advantage in that at all. And they're actually, you could certainly think that the people in Silicon Valley have some advantages that oil companies aren't likely to have. When you think about a lot of the alternative, the sort of second and third generation energy sources, as you move further away from the conventional fossil fuel model, I think it gets harder and harder to make the argument that these companies necessarily should be in those businesses. If they choose to be, that's fine, if they actually think they have some real advantage. But right out of the box, it's a pretty tough argument to make. And so I think that really we need to be careful in thinking about public policy to distinguish between the makers of the previous, the fossil fuels, and the new fuels, who may end up being the same, but we shouldn't think that there's any particular connection. Oil companies tend to like it when I say that part, since they don't like particularly being told they have to invent the solutions. On the other hand, that also should point out that they really are just contributing to the world oil market, and they don't really control the price of oil. And that's a pretty strong argument for why the government shouldn't be encouraging investment in new oil drilling in the United States. And in fact, that I think could be a pretty strong argument for eliminating tax incentives for oil and gas exploration, though that's somewhat off the topic. The oil companies don't like it as much when I say that, obviously. I think the real issue here, though, is that, well, it's great to hear what these companies are doing, and a lot of other companies are doing, to move into alternative energy sources. A large part of the intellectual property that is going to be created, that's going to support the new energy infrastructure and the new energy economy, has got to come from support from the federal government. These are creation of new intellectual property. Some of this is going to be the business application of existing ideas, but I think as John Doerr made clear in his earlier discussion, and I really strongly agree with, if we're going to solve this problem on a global basis, we're going to need some major basic science breakthroughs. And although those may come out of private industry, the track record, I think, is also pretty strong that some of the basic science, the incentive for the basic science breakthroughs is probably greatest when we have an open intellectual property process, such as from federal labs and from universities and so forth. I don't do this sort of research, so I can push for more R&D funding with a clean conscience. And as John Doerr, I think, made quite clear, the federal government has gone the opposite direction over the last 10 years. And let me just close with one more thought. I would bet if we ask these companies, and I'm sure we will, what is it they're looking for from the federal government, my guess is the first answer will be policy certainty. That is, they want to know what the benchmark is going to be, what the policy is going to be on greenhouse gases, what the penalty is going to be for various other forms of pollution and land use and so forth, and then let us figure out how to optimize against that on a business level. But when there's policy vagueness, it makes it very hard to invest. And that's true, and I agree with that, and points out that we really do need to put a priority on that. But we also have to realize that there's a real tension when you come to asking for policy certainty, which is that there isn't science certainty. There would be a much easier argument to make if we actually knew what we needed to do to solve this problem. We knew what the real parameters of the problem were, and we don't. It is possible we are going to find out, I think decreasingly likely, but possible we are going to find out that climate change really isn't that big a deal. And we don't really need to move away. And in fact, the producing motor fuels from coal without worrying about CO2 really does solve our national security problem, and that's all we need. That's not likely to happen, but if it did, the right policy, public policy, would be very different than if we find out, in fact, that the CO2 buildup is faster than we thought and the climate change is occurring more rapidly, in which case we're going to have to ramp up these requirements much more quickly. So while I think there will be a call for policy certainty, and I'm very sympathetic to it, I think we also have to recognize that there's going to be this tension as we also learn more about what the policy problem is and how we are going to respond to that on a public policy basis is certainly going to drive how these and all the other businesses respond to it.
Thank you. So do any of you want to respond to that?
Sure.
Okay.
I think the story has three aspects. One, of course, Professor Borenstein mentioned that, he knows very well, that the competences of oil companies have long gone beyond getting oil out of the ground. So we have infrastructure, we have the customer base, we have knowledge about markets, we have networks, we know how to handle big projects. So, interesting. What else can you feed in that competence chain? Alternative energy fits quite well. Second one is the long-term future. Yeah. If you look at that, now then you wonder, do you want to be a player there, yes or no? And if you want to be a player there, how are you going to get there? Now, some oil companies have decided to wait and buy themselves into that future when that future is a certainty. Now, in Shell, we have decided that it is worthwhile to learn while we go there. So we have started making investments in that area. And probably the third reason why oil companies are looking into this new area is that, and I think it was also John Doerr mentioning this is the biggest investment opportunity for this century. So of course we want to go there. All companies who can go there want to go there, and we will certainly try to be there and be a player there.
I think, in terms of the competencies, one that hasn't really been brought out is the distribution network. So if you're looking at a future equivalent of oil that's distributed in a vast number of locations, oil companies, the integrated ones that own their own distribution networks, are an obvious way to distribute the fuel. But I think if we look at disruptive futures, one aspect here is that when we talk about future fuel, we have blurring. You know, how does electricity come into the mix? And so part of the unknowns, and I know we'll talk about later, are future business models. Outside in the posters, you have information on new battery technology, you have information on hybrid vehicles. So the fuels companies, which is what you have represented here, have distribution networks. But if you start looking at crossovers into electricity, you're starting to look at a lot of different models.
Paul, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit. When we talked on the phone, you mentioned that one aspect of BP's strategy is to kind of make use of the existing infrastructure. And of course, BP has this enormous network of pipelines around the world and a large distribution infrastructure. And perhaps you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I think that's something that's not unique to BP, actually. I mean, all of major oil companies have huge invested infrastructure. But if you look at the current generation, if we talk specifically about biofuels and transportation fuels now, there's lots of limitations that come with ethanol that make it undesirable, right? It's not compatible with the existing infrastructure. You have to ship it by rail or road to just before the going out to the terminal. It's blended at the last minute. You can only put 10% into the gasoline pool without getting into trouble with engines, etc. So the incentives for coming up with something in the biofuels area that's actually compatible with both the existing infrastructure as well as the existing vehicle park is, if something like that exists, I mean, that's going to be a clear winner. Not because we want it to be, but because the amount of invested assets and capital, not just on behalf of major oil companies, but also on behalf of all of yourselves, right? So the vehicle park in the United States turns over every 15 to 20 years. So, there's lots of cars out there that you can't just one morning wake up and say, oh, from next Monday we're going to run on a whole new fuel. That, by the way, doesn't work in the car that you have. We all have to go out and buy new ones, etc. So the existing momentum for coming up with things which are actually compatible to the infrastructure that society has already built and invested in, from a transportation fuels point of view, is actually huge. And certainly that's one of our objectives with, like the research we will be doing in our EBI, etc., is to try to play in that space.
All right. I think another interesting question is where the companies are sort of placing their bets on the fuels. We all know the story of, well, I guess it's a Blu-ray now, but basically beta and VCRs, where you put your bets. And I think I would really like to hear from the panelists a bit about where those bets are at the moment and kind of what the thinking is. And I thought maybe Gabriel could lead off by talking a little bit about both the work in hydrogen, which he mentioned before, and kind of the new work in algae.
Okay. Let's start with the shareholders. The shareholders are the owners of the company, so you would think that they direct us in what choices we should make fuels-wise. Now, the problem is that there are a whole variety of shareholders. There are the socially responsible funds and the NGOs, and then there are the core shareholders. Now, the socially responsible funds and the NGOs, you know what they would want us to do, but the core shareholder group is actually quite negative in that area. So they don't stimulate that type of direction very much. So there's not much steer from that side. So the choices that we are making are based on our own technology assessments, on our well-to-wheel studies, the fit with our competences, legislation and mandates, and our view of the future. So when we made choices, it is like putting some pots on a fire, which is an expression our CEO used, and our investor relations people didn't like him using that. So, in hydrogen, for instance.
Could you repeat the phrase that your CEO uses?
Pots on the fire. It's a direct translation of a Dutch expression into English, and so most people, well, I guess you know what I'm talking about. It's an option strategy, right? So in hydrogen, for instance, because you asked me to talk about hydrogen, we sort of stumbled into hydrogen with Iceland. That was a first attempt of going into this area without a full strategy thought out behind it. But then it was such a success, and a team within Shell was created to find out whether we should go and do more of that type of work. This team then presented to our committee of managing directors at that time, what you would call our executive team. And it was, to tell you the truth, it is just a matter of having a champion in a certain area. So the team that presented the story about hydrogen had so much passion and had so much connection with the executive committee that a Shell Hydrogen was created. And so we went to California, set up some stations there, and at some point we went to Asia, and that's where I met Lisa in Shanghai. because I had helped set up the station in Iceland. And in Shanghai, we were trying to do the same thing. And that is, so some things you don't plan. Who do we meet there? Professor Wang Gang. Professor Wang Gang, the dean of the university, of Tongji University in Shanghai, he supported this initiative. So we built the Shanghai station there. And guess what? Professor Wang Gang is now the Minister of Science and Technology of the People's Republic of China, and he is not even a member of the Communist Party. So how these things work? Yeah, I don't know. It's not driven by shareholders. I think it's really driven by passion and by people within a company who stand up and champion an idea. And later on, as with, I guess, good scientific theories, the theory is developed after you've seen some evidence that it works.
Wow, that was very interesting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the thinking within your company affected the sort of bets that you've placed on fuels, and also a little bit about whether or not shareholders have affected that.
Within Chevron, Chevron took a leadership role in terms of the very recent National Petroleum Council study on future supply and demand. And coming out of that, our top executives were convinced that we need all forms of energy to meet the projected demand with where we're starting from with the infrastructure perspective. We're going to have to go after everything. If you look at that, and of course, what the National Petroleum MPC did, National Petroleum Council did, is it's a study of studies. And so like anything else, as I said, views on the future is, it's not necessarily correct. There can always be surprises. But if you look out there in the time frames, we have to go after unconventional sources of traditional hydrocarbons, whether they're oil shale, gas to liquids, coal to liquids, and so all the different forms. So when you look out there, it's a time of tremendous opportunity, as we said. So we're pursuing things all the way across, from all the downstream different forms of oil, because oil is in many different forms, natural gas, how you bring natural gas to market. If you look around the world, everyone, whenever oil price goes up, they say we're running out of oil. But there's lots of natural gas around the world, which at current market conditions is not being brought to market. And there are lots of types of technologies, including gas to liquids and LNG and other transportation methods that could bring that to market. North America has, in general, a shortage of natural gas, which in terms of greenhouse gas emissions has about half the emissions of coal. So you have some tremendous leverage there. So we're pursuing that from our core base through other things, as mentioned, that leverage into the existing distribution and vehicle infrastructure.
So within BP, our motivation certainly is not to go into alternative energy because we're running out of oil or we're running out of gas in the scheme of the world. It's really more driven by a fundamental belief that climate change issues are going to be really critical going forward, and that those companies who can actually provide energy solutions that deliver both energy and protect from a climate change perspective are clearly going to be winners. And whether our shareholders are excited about that, I think it depends on who you talk to. It's like a big family. It's hard to make everybody happy with everything. But certainly when we do things where it's clear that we're actually leveraging either existing assets or existing skill sets, or we build on things we already know how to do, that it's easier for shareholders to relate to that and be able to say, well, I can see how this could grow into something that's of value for the future. So for instance, just two examples. wind farms, right? So oil companies, by definition, own quite a lot of land leases, and some of those land leases, sometimes happen to be in remote and windy places, where actually constructing wind farms is quite an interesting way of using some of your existing assets. Carbon capture and storage is another one where there's a lot of synergy between what oil companies do today to get stuff out of the ground, to actually learn how to put things safely into the ground, that people can actually relate to, that these are natural extensions of the skill sets and the assets that we have that shareholders can actually subscribe to.
These themes keep coming up, so I think it's actually important to make a distinction here. And when we talk about these alternative lines of business for the oil companies, there are sort of non-conventional fossil fuels that are often pointed to as a solution to some energy problem. But it's important to make the distinction between an energy security problem, or an energy supply problem, or an energy price problem. It comes up in all those ways, and a greenhouse gas problem. Coal to liquids is sort of the poster boy for this. There's a lot of coal out there, and if we really thought the price of oil was going to stay at the current level for a long time and there weren't other restrictions, big investment in coal to liquids would be a great bet. You can definitely make money at $100 a barrel. It would obviously be, with the current technology, a very bad bet for the environment. The current technology, production of transportation fuels from coal, which is a completely doable technology, produces many times the greenhouse gases of pulling oil out of the ground, which is also, by the way, true of oil sands as it is currently being made into transportation fuels. So if that is really going to be a solution to both of these problems, we don't really have the cost-effective technology. That's something that still has to come. When we talk about public policy, unfortunately, these things often get confused. The coal industry, which I'll feel free to bash up here, is very happy to tell us that coal is the solution to the energy problem by redefining the problem to be one of energy security. There is no such thing as clean coal currently at an economic process, and actually there's unlikely to be anytime soon. The cleanest coal is likely to get, if all of the technologies we're working on right now work in the next few decades, is back to oil. That is, if you can actually do coal to liquids processing and capture the CO2 from that process, you then pour hydrocarbons into cars and burn them, and they release CO2 in the same way we're doing it right now. So, we have to understand that when we go down that road, it actually could be a major help in dealing with energy security and energy cost issues, but it could end up actually being a problem in dealing with environmental issues. And in analyzing any of these alternative energy processes, I think we have to keep both of those in mind. Eve made the very good point that every form of energy has an environmental footprint. I once, in my energy markets class, made the mistake of saying, a really clean technology like solar photovoltaics, and one of the students rolled her eyes and said, "Are you kidding? The heavy metals in those things, when they go into the dumps, they're a major problem." Apparently there is an environmental problem with solar PV that I wasn't aware of. But there is with everything. Likewise, though, there really is cost variation with all of these that we also need to think about. When we find the cheap alternatives, so far they're not the environmentally friendly ones.
Great. I'd like to go on to the next question, which is really looking at the kind of business models that companies, large oil companies, are going to use, and also startup companies. I mean, obviously this space is, right now there are a lot of startup companies. There are also national labs and university labs that are working on things that will spin out of there into small companies. And then we have big companies with big resources and the ability to both place large bets and perhaps influence the marketing of them to make those bets work. But there's a lot of interesting questions from the oil company's point of view about the best way to pursue this. Many things, the oil companies are notorious for being huge, and they get to control every aspect of the supply chain, and that may not be the best way to develop sort of a small venture, or to really look for the most exciting ideas. The other thing that's happening is that the technology itself is changing, as Eve sort of hinted at. You know, when you start really talking about a plug-in hybrid, you get into some very interesting areas, because right now, when we buy cars, they're separate from when we buy the fuel. So we buy a car, and then we go and we buy the fuel separately, and that affects the way we buy cars, and it affects the way cars are sold. It also affects the way fuel is sold. But when you buy a plug-in hybrid, particularly if you were, say, leasing your plug-in hybrid from your utility company, the fuel and the tool of the car start to get commingled. And it gets even further complicated when you, say, are doing something like Google has suggested with the vehicle-to-grid plan of being able to charge up your car at night off the grid, drive it to work, and then kind of day trade your electricity back onto the grid during the heat of the day. I mean, you end up with something where you can't really tell where the car and the fuel begin and leave. And so this is the sort of, as oil companies, I think, start to look out, they look at the idea of what is fuel starting to change, what is energy. Energy is somewhat of a constant, but the fuel and what they're selling and what they're buying is going to start to change. So I would like, Eve did some work on plug-in hybrids and talked quite beautifully when we talked before, just about the complexities and the disruptive, the potential for a really kind of disruptive business.
Lisa and I had a very nice conversation earlier this week in preparation for this session. And when I was doing venture capital, looking at the models in terms of how venture capital applies to the energy business, and doing venture capital for an oil company. And so I've looked at these things, and you have a lot of different factors coming together. One thing that we haven't discussed about alternative energy, or in terms of these clean alternatives, as opposed to the fossil fuels, is if you look at it, when we talk about biofuels, and we're typically talking about biomass, what are the things we have to do? Whether it's a food product or a non-food product feedstock, first thing you have to do is go out and collect it all. Then you bring it in and you put it through processing, and ultimately you come out with something that is oil-like. Well, if you look at oil, oil is basically Mother Nature's biofuels. It started out from the same sort of plant mass, but basically nature has, over millions of years, done the pre-processing for us, breaking it down, gathering it, so that what's beautiful about oil is that once we find it and bring it to the surface, the amount of additional energy that has to be added to bring it to the point where it fuels a car is relatively small. And so what you have in the current fuels infrastructure is a highly centralized system. You have relatively few refineries in the US. The fuel goes out, is transported to the stations, so you have large central nodes going outward. If you look at the electricity grid, it's predicated on the same sort of thing, which is you have centralized generation, and then it goes outward. So it goes from the center out to the edges of the grid. If you look at what we're trying to do with alternative energy, we're basically way back at the harvesting stage of harvesting dispersed energy. We're looking to basically scavenge energy in various forms. And so one of the huge costs is if you stay with the centralized business model that oil companies have due to the nature of their fuel, that electrical utilities have due to the nature of generation right now, even if it is with large hydro, which is the major renewable energy source in electricity generation now, it's central out. But if you look at solar, wind, biofuels, in a sense, because they're still scattered around, you know, they're distributed. So you say, what type of new business models will come up here? So one of the aspects is just as there's room for new technology, there's room for what will the business models of these next generations of energy supplies be?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, we would wholly agree with the fact that new business models are going to be emerging out of all this, whether that's actually for us the way we do business or somewhere in the value chain of how business gets conducted. I would like to make one comment though, because so we tend to focus in a lot on the transportation sector in these conversations, but if you're actually after addressing greenhouse gas problems from a world perspective, then you wouldn't arrive at the conclusion that transportation is actually your highest priority problem to go solve. You know, the electricity consumption and electricity generation and also large industrial uses are actually much bigger contributors to the overall greenhouse gas issues and greenhouse gas growth than the transportation sector is. And sometimes it's easy to just kind of move the problem around, because we could say, well, okay, if we all drive electric cars, well, aren't we off the hook? Because our car is no longer emitting any CO2 out of the back of our vehicles. But obviously, that just moved the problem to somewhere else, because somebody actually has to make the electricity that you use to charge your batteries and et cetera. So I think from within the company, really, our belief is that we need to be working all of these problems. And there is not one solution that somehow is going to emerge one day that sort of magically solve this thing for everybody. And having, as a company, a portfolio of solutions that actually addresses the entire energy spectrum, as opposed to just the transportation fuels or just the refining aspects, et cetera, really is a good long-term approach to the issue, because first of all, you know, different problems require different solutions. And if we actually came up with an electric car that moved the problem from the car to the power plant, well, that might be great if you actually have a good solution for the power plant. So, you know, thinking of it in a whole society kind of way is very much what's needed. Your original question also had to do with competition. And is this a competitive race, or are we in a collaborative process? I think fundamentally all of business is about competition, and actually society counts on competition to get to the right answer in the long run. And so this for us is also an aspect of competition. But that doesn't mean that you can't have an open innovation model, or that small startup companies cannot be part of addressing this problem in the beginning and coming up with some technical solutions that then need to be scaled up. But in order to go after the kinds of size problem that we're actually facing, you know, it's going to take big companies to address a big problem and change it in a big way. So, you know, we should be actually excited about the fact that big companies like Shell and Chevron and BP are involved with this, because it actually gives you a chance of actually saying, well, maybe these companies will have the resources to actually go do something about it.
Lisa, can I just ask one question of the panel members, because we've sort of gone through what's in the business model. Is there anything that's outside the business model? For instance, I think all three of your companies would certainly think about working on energy storage technologies and batteries. My guess is you probably wouldn't think about getting into the auto business. Although energy efficiency, or maybe making appliances that are more energy efficiency. Is that, I mean, I'm trying to figure out where the boundaries of the competence is. If you're
For us, we definitely would think of collaborating with car makers on how can we provide better lubricants and better fuels that result in fuel savings in vehicles. We would not be thinking about going into battery technology because that's something that's completely outside of what we would consider our expertise. So there are some things that are in and some things that are clearly out, certainly from our company perspective.
Would the other two of you agree on the battery technology?
Chevron actually has a battery company.
That is chemical engineering. It's sort of what
it's chemical engineering, and I think one point I wanted to build on that Paul had was the aspect of the interaction between the utilities and the oil companies, because and he was touching on it in terms of the CO2 emissions, where I was talking about what's centralized and what's dispersed. So if you look at the CO2 emissions that come from the fuel in vehicles, those emissions are widely dispersed. So you have a tremendous collection problem. Whereas at the electric utilities, in generating electricity, those are very concentrated emissions. So if you're going to do CO2 sequestration, the obvious first target are electrical utilities, particularly the coal-fired plants. And with coal-fired plants, there are other, as was pointed out, emissions and pollutants that it's very important to address as well, or you have problems like acid rain. But if you say, who has the core competencies? Because the leading contender for dealing with CO2 emissions from fossil fuels is geological sequestration of CO2, which is basically capturing it where you have concentrated emissions and re-injecting it in the ground. And when you say, who knows about how much you can hold in the ground and how long and how safely it can be held underground and has the technology to do it, you come back to the oil companies, because we're the ones who pump things in and out of the ground all the time. And you might think we just pump things out, but a large part of oil production involves pumping vast amounts of water back in the ground to get more oil out. We have, for over 2 decades, used CO2 to enhance oil production, where actually CO2 has been produced from naturally occurring CO2 reservoirs and pipelined hundreds of miles to enhance oil recovery. And Chevron has had long-term CO2 floods to have enhanced oil recovery. And in those you might say, well, if you're not doing it for greenhouse gas reasons, you're probably very sloppy with the CO2. Well, oil companies, as I mentioned, we try to be extremely efficient because it's money. And if you're paying for CO2 and pipelining it hundreds of miles, it costs you a lot of money. So we're very careful in those operations to reuse the CO2 so that we don't minimize how much we have to buy, because it's a cost to us if we lose it. So there are a lot of interesting synergies, and that's kind of a flip on your business model where suddenly, the question is, does one company want to assume the liability for another market segment's pollutant?
I think it would have been interesting if we'd had someone from the utilities up here to see if they were planning to take on the oil companies. Gabriel, do you have something to respond to this?
Well, maybe just replying to your question, we found out that we're not so good in making little things and selling them. So we tried, we had a few ventures in that area, but we're better in processes. But in those areas where this is important, like storage, energy storage, hydrogen storage, we had a venture in fuel cells. We want to take minority interests and in that way play in that area. The second thing is, of course, you talked about the distributed nature of new energy. There's one other dimension that we have been struggling with, and that is that these new projects are very much integrated projects. One example is integrated businesses. Even within Shell, we have issues. For instance, when you look at gasification, different Shell businesses have to work together. And before you can make that happen, it's just difficult, I have to admit. And in algae, it goes cross-industry. We're looking at biology, we're looking at the animal feed business, and we have our own business in there. And to make all these three businesses or industries to work together is also a new aspect for us in our new business models.
Okay, I think we are running towards the end of our time, so I want to skip ahead to one kind of a look at what some of the barriers are to moving forward. I think for a lot of us, we have defined one of the big issues in moving clean tech forward in the US has really been, can we get a price on carbon and start to price some of the externalities of oil, and then hopefully the market will take care, market and technology will take care of moving us forward. But in having some talks with the panelists, one of the things that came out is that that's probably sort of the beginning of the policy hassles. Once we have the price on carbon, if we were to move seriously into biofuels, we would actually need a whole bunch of other sorts of policies because other things will be shifting. And so I wanted to sort of start by having Paul talk just a little bit about some of the barriers, some of the policy issues that, say, biofuels are going to bring up that will be both local and will become international as well. And we don't have a whole lot of time, so we'll talk about that very briefly. And then the other panelists will also talk about other barriers.
Okay, so we'll try to be as brief as I can. So I think one very fundamental issue that we are having to work through is the mismatch between the size of the problem, both the sheer size of energy markets and the long-term duration of like climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and significantly changing the energy mix versus the short-term processes that we all use in society. Whether that be the political process or the processes that you all use when you decide to buy something or not buy something. So there's a real mismatch between a 30 and 50-year horizon, which is really where these kinds of issues play, versus the election coming up in a few months' time, and another election and another election. And it's not obvious that a succession of 15 or 20 short-term decisions actually leads to the right long-term decision. So that's a real tricky thing for us as a society to deal with. There's also lots of issues around biofuels, which are in the food. They tend to be phrased in polarizing ways. It's food versus fuel. It's conservation versus growth. It's poverty versus being rich, etc. And in most of these cases, the polarizing way of putting the argument actually is not productive because it's not food or fuel. Actually, we need to find ways of producing both. Etc. And you can apply those same kinds of things to all the other arguments. And as a society, you actually need to get a way of talking about these things productively rather than in a polarizing way. The issues of land use and land use change is a good example of really significant issues around biofuels that can be addressed either productively or very bureaucratically. Currently, there's lots of debate around how to do these things, which tends towards the bureaucratic, unfortunately. We talk about life cycle analysis and how we're going to measure all these things, which are very good academic concepts in terms of distinguishing between A and B, but they're very difficult to actually administer as policies. The world needs to be braver about actually having a land use policy that's not tied one-for-one with biofuels, but actually that is a separate policy which addresses the issues that are relevant in the sphere of land use, whether they are about biofuels or eating more meat. Right? So we need to be braver in terms of how we address those kinds of issues if we really want to get out of the swamp, because otherwise we will end up in a forever debate and no action, and we need action.
Action. Action is exactly what we're going to need, because we start a little bit late, and obviously this session is ending, as you can see everyone filing in. I think we have time for maybe 2 very quick questions. Is there anybody? Yes? Oh, just a second, I think Michael's actually taking the question, sorry.
Just a point on the feed versus fuel debate. When you're attacking that from a completely different angle, we're using 70% of our corn in this country to feed cattle, which we're feeding to humans, at a ratio of 1 to 8, right? And we're producing about 4,000 calories per capita, whereas everybody only needs 2,000. So if everybody would go on a diet, eat just half the amount of meat that they are currently eating, we would have about 30% more available corn. We wouldn't have the corn problems. We wouldn't have any of those issues at all. Just to get the numbers straight.
Okay, so let's stick. If there's one more question, we can take that. And from what I understand, also you can increase your miles per gallon by weighing less. An added benefit of eating less beef.
So I'm going to wrap this up into a couple. How concerned were you all when GM made an announcement about a partnership with Coscata? Do you think, if you really believed that there was a future in biofuels, wouldn't you all be investing in agriculture land or buying Weyerhaeuser? And third, do you think the next CEO of any of your companies is going to come out of the renewable business unit in the next, let's say, 10 years?
Okay, because I'm the moderator, I'm going to choose that last one. Any thoughts?
Absolutely certain that our next CEO will have spent some time in the renewable business. Yeah.
I think predicting who the next CEO is always a dangerous proposition.
So I think within BP, I mean, our former CEO and our current CEO are very much involved with this agenda. So while they're not from the alternative energy business, they're certainly very much involved with it.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you to the panelists. I really appreciate you being here.
And thank you very much to Lisa Marginelli once again for doing such a great job moderating this panel. Thank you.